Welcome to Widgets1. In OutSystems, widgets are the elements that help us build our screens, and since there are quite a few of them, we've broken them into two different sections. So in Widgets1, we'll look at the first and more basic set of the widgets. So in this session, we'll talk about what a widget is and some of its properties. Then we'll look at the simple widgets, including the expression widget and the image widgets. We'll also discuss multi-record widgets, like the table and list record widgets. And then at the end, we'll look at the input widgets, which also have to do with the form widget. So let's go ahead and get started. So widgets are the basic building blocks of screens. So they're going to be the visual elements that we use. We can simply drag and drop them and then build up the screens from the elements that we put there. So over here we can see in the toolbox that there are a huge number of widgets available. And at any given time, when we want to use a widget, we just drag it and drop it to the screen. And in this particular case, we're seeing an input widget being dragged to a form, and it becomes the input field for the surname. So each of the widgets, when we drag and drop it to the screen, will also have a set of properties. And those properties can be defined, and typically the properties revolve around the source data that that widget needs, what the behavior of the widget should be, and the styles, or how the widget should actually look. And typically it's good to review these properties and kind of set them as soon as we can when we drag them onto the screen. So again, here we see an input widget, which is called city input. It has a variable, or the source that it would come from, which is city. And if it's blank, the field ends up being empty and then just waits for the input to be added. There are lots of other different types of properties here, but one that's interesting is the style class, which says which style from the style sheet should be used to describe how that input widget should look. And then we also have something down here at the bottom, which is on change. So if someone changes what's in the input field, should something happen, and that can be the behavior. And when we say behavior, that might be an action, or the destination could actually be just another screen, but typically it's some sort of action that we might do. So these are just some of the basic properties, and for each widget, the types of properties that exist are different. So let's look at a few of the widgets. And if we start with two of the simplest ones, we have two different widgets that can display text. We have the text widget that will display static text that isn't going to change. So in this case, the text widget has just one property that we care about, and that's the text, and whatever's in the text is what will be displayed. We also have an expression widget which displays calculated variables. So in that case, the value property gets evaluated at runtime, and that is the result that will be displayed. There's also an example property, and this example property is what will be displayed inside the development environment, because we may not have the ability to evaluate, or the different values that might be in the variable field, the variable in the value field, may not be able to be determined. So by having an example, it's easy to see what's going to be on the screen. We also have the image widget. So the image widget does what you would expect. It will display an image on the screen, and the source of the image widget will be defined by the type of image that we set. And there are three different types. So here you can see in the image property that if we choose for it to be a static image, then all we need to set is the image, and that means that it'll actually be one of the images in the image folder, and this will just need to select the name of that image. We can also have an external image, and for the external image, we just have to describe the URL where we can find that image, and it will display it that way. And then there's also what we call the database widget. And the database widget is going to retrieve an image from the database by pulling out the binary data from the database. And in that particular case, that means that we need an entity identifier to be able to get the right entity, and we need to know what attribute. So in this case, a user profile's picture may be the image that we want to display. We also have multi-record widgets, and one of them that we use quite often is what we call the table records widget. And this will display multiple records in a tabular format. And what it'll do is place one record in each row. And then each cell can hold other widgets that might be available, but by default, each cell will have an expression widget. So it will use an expression to go ahead and display the calculated variable for whatever needs to be in the table. And the size of the cells will adapt to how big the information in the expression is. So all of this table information will come from what we call a source record, and because it's a table, we need a list of things. And then what will actually happen is inside the table records widget, it will make its own copy of the source record list. And then that copy will be iterated over as it needs to go ahead and display that list. So it's a little easier if we look at the example. In this particular case, the table record that we're working on here has a source record list of get addresses. So we can name this the address table, and inside the address table, the address has a street attribute, it has a zip code, and it has a city. And we can see that inside the widget itself, it shows us 3 different rows that are possible because it's not retrieving the actual data. It's just saying that the first row may have something like this for the street, and this for the zip code, and this for the city. The second one becomes a little less bright, and the last one is less bright as well. So it's just showing that there will be many of these. And depending on how many, we can see things like line count that can decide how many of the rows that we might actually show. And again, like all of the widgets that we described, you could change the style and the way it looks. In this particular case, there's a header, which the header style could be different than the actual body style. So there are a lot of things that you can control here, including whether or not you want to show the header at the top of the table. So lots of cool things to do inside of the table records. Now, when you go to create a table records widget and describe the layout, there is an accelerator that will allow you to go ahead and grab an entity from the data tab. So when we drag and drop a table records widget into the editor, into the canvas where we're building our screen, it will just create an empty area. And then it will actually tell us that we need to drag an entity or an attribute here. So if we grab the address entity and drop it in here, it will immediately look at the address entity and it will go ahead and choose its attributes and create the table for us because it knows what those attributes are. In this case, there are 3 of them, so it's fairly easy. If there are 6 or 8 or 10 of them, it will only display the first 4 that it can get and turn into text. So sometimes it may seem like some of the attributes are missing, and that's because entities with a lot of attributes won't show all of them to start with. But there also is this toolbar at the top of the editor when we are using a table record, and this is here to allow us to add new columns, delete other columns, and move columns. So here it says we can add a new one. The red is for the delete, and the arrow would let us move columns back and forth. Now once the table exists, we can actually take other widgets and drag and drop them in between the columns, and we can also adjust the style. So it's not as if once the table is created, it has to stay exactly that way. We're still allowed to modify and change pieces that are inside the table. Now something similar to the table records is the list records widget. And the list records widget is also going to show a list of information, so it'll display multiple records, but it does so in a free-form layout. And when we say free-form, it just means that there are no rows and columns, there are no lines inside of a table, and that after each row or record that is displayed, it has to decide what to do next. And when we say decide what to do next, it says that there is a line separator, and that line separator will decide what to do in between the various records. So here we're choosing a new line, but we could choose to do nothing, and then one record after another would just be placed inside of the user interface. We still need to have a source record list to know the source of the data to be displayed, and just like the table makes a copy of that source record, the list record does the same thing as well. Now, when we're not displaying things in larger sets of data, we may actually wish to be taking in data or just showing individual records instead of the whole list of all of the records. So one way to do that is to actually use input widgets. So input widgets allow the end user to submit new data. The input widget will get bound to a variable, and it can be set to mandatory so that we have to have that type of input. So here we can see an input widget, and in this case it's bound to the variable city. And that city is going to expect text as far as the input. And we can see other things about the input, like the max length is going to be 50. We'll show it in just one line, and it too has a style for how it's supposed to look. Now, besides the input widgets, we also have a special input password widget so that when people type something in, any content entered into the widget is masked. So that will hide the information that's being typed in. And for the input password, we can have text or numeric fields because it is a password type. So the input password automatically has its type. It's going to accept text, but it is a password type of text. Now, when we use input widgets to take different types of input in, typically when we're working on a screen that is requiring input, there's some label next to the input field to tell us what we're supposed to go ahead and add inside that field. So the label is usually displayed next to an input widget, and it can evaluate its value property and display the result as the label. And this can also be bound to a specific input widget. So before, we saw the input city widget. So the city input widget would probably have a city label. And in this case, we have value, and the value is just the string city. So that's what's going to be displayed in the label. But that also means that if we had some sort of variable here that might be evaluated to change the way the label is going to look and the value of that label, we could also do that as well. Here it tells you exactly which input widget it's tied to, and the reason that this is important is because if an input is mandatory, we want to generate a visual cue on the label to make sure users know they have to add this one. So in a lot of places we use a red star to go ahead and say that the input widget for city has to be entered, or it will create a validation error. So if those are the inputs end up going into a form. And the form will present a single record for displaying or editing, and there are no layout constraints. All we'll do is bind this to a source record, and then that data will be displayed. And once it is displayed, then people would be able to change that information and save it again. So the form widget is holding a copy of a source again, and it'll display the copy if it needs to. If there is nothing inside of the source record, then the form is going to appear empty. So sometimes we come to something like the address form, and everything's empty because they want us to input our address. So here you can see the address form itself, and the address form has a source record of get address by list, and it's bringing back the current one. So this kind of shows us how some of that can work. And when we're actually trying to create a form widget, we can also use one of the accelerators. So when we have the form, if we wish to create a row, we can actually drag and drop that from an entity. So in this particular case, if we went to address and dragged street over here, it would go ahead and put the label in as well as the input widget. And then in that case, the input variable would reference the form it wouldn't actually reference the entity or anything else because the form is keeping a copy of that source like we mentioned. Now, another interesting or important thing to note is that the form is allowed to contain other widgets. So if we wanted to add another widget to display something in here, it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the data inside the form, but it can also be displayed inside the form as needed. Now, there's one other thing to note here. As we talked about all of these widgets, if you go back and look at the various widgets that we've discussed, every time we look at a widget, the widget has a blue tab, and at the top it shows the icon of that widget type, and then it will show the name of that widget. And sometimes by default, there is no name for the widget. So if we don't name our widgets, the widgets will actually take on the name that they expect. So sometimes OutSystems will fill this in, sometimes it will be blank. A lot of times if we put a text widget in there, it just says text because we didn't give the text widget a name. But these are the types of things that you'll get used to seeing. And the reason this little tab is important is that if you wish to move this widget somewhere else, you can actually grab the tab and move it. So you'll be getting a chance to work with some of these widgets and see how some of that works as you work on the exercises. So we've covered a lot of info. We looked at the widgets and their properties, and then we looked at the simple widgets, the expressions, the images, and the text. We went over the multi-record widgets, which were the table and list widgets, and then we also looked at how forms and inputs will allow us to either display single records or go ahead and allow them to be edited or even to take brand new inputs as a single record in. So that's it for Widgets 1. Thanks for listening.